Sorry, I have to go through my notes as English is not my first language. So thanks to Asia Now for inviting us today to discuss the topic of independent photo book publishing in Asia. In recent years in Asia, the photo book has become an autonomous medium of expression for photographers. And today, Simon Baker and Zhen Shi are going to introduce some recent photo books from Japan and China. I've been invited in a capacity of director of Jimei Arles Photography Festival. It's a festival that was created in Xiamen in the south of China 5 years ago by Rencontre d'Arles and Three Shadows Photography Art Center. Three Shadows Photography Art Center is the first photography museum created in China 12 years ago by a couple of photographers who's actually Chinese and Japanese. Zhongzhong, the Chinese part of the couple, founded the first independent photography journal in China in the 90s. And right now, Jimei Arles also acts as a platform for photo book reading and showcasing in China. Every year we have, as one of the 8 exhibitions traveling from France to China from Rencontre d'Arles, one of them is the Photo Book Awards. So we have 100 books coming to China that actually are donated to the photo book library of Three Shadows, which has become maybe the most complete photo book collection available publicly in China. And we also every year showcase photo books from young photographers who are showing in the festival or not through the store of Three Shadows library. As I don't know who the audience is today, and as Simon and Zhen Shi are going to talk more specifically about contemporary photo books, I prepared a short introduction based on the Chinese photo book published by Martin Parr at Aperture in 2016, just to provide a few historical context to the contemporary production of photo books by young publishing houses such as La Maison de Z. So please let me know if anything is unclear or if my accent is too strong. So just to start from the beginning and going back to a time where photo books were not conceived as artistic statements, the first type of publications of illustrated books were linked to the rise of the colonial powers in China. And here we can see one of the first publications about China, which was addressed to the elites back in France or in the United Kingdom or in Europe. It's called La Chine à terre et en ballon, and it's a collection of photos taken by French military officers sent to China during the Boxer Rebellion. A few years earlier, the first photo book to date, maybe, was published in 1873 by John Thompson, and it's a collection of 4 volumes called Illustrations of China and Its People. And these photo books produced, of course, a sort of exotic vision of China. That we have built on since then. Gradually, after these first photo books published by Western photographers and Western publishing houses, Chinese photographers themselves started mastering photography and design and album publishing, and that's actually how the first Chinese homegrown photography books were produced. They were more photography albums or coming from studios led by Chinese photographers. So either albums made for their clients or albums acting as a promotion means for their own studios. Here we can see one of those coming from a photographer called Liang Shetai who photographed the imperial court and produced a photography album about Prince Chun. So that's one of the earliest examples. And then during the, one image is missing. But basically during the 1930s and the Republican era, as China was becoming more liberal politically and economically and was entering the industrial era, especially in Shanghai, where the press and the magazine publication was very strong, there was also a rise of photography publications, either in the form of magazines or the first monographs of Chinese photographers. And I think that Simon is going to introduce one of them a bit later by Lang Qingshan, or you are. Yeah. Following this period of that we can consider like maybe the first wave of self-made publications or independent publishing in China. After the founding of the PRC in 1949, the Communist Party became the author and the publisher of photography books in China, and photography became one of the main means for propaganda. Also, just to show a few examples, this book is from 1955, so 6 years after the founding of the PRC, and it's called Happy Youth in China, Happy Youth of China, and it's one of the many examples during that period of the birth of the revolutionary nation of books showing the utopia of the communist dream and replacing the author by a collective entity. The photographers were no longer credited, the editors were no longer individual publishing houses or individual people. It became collective entities dependent on the Communist Party. Sorry. And this is a later example of one of the numerous books produced in 1959 for the 10th anniversary of the PRC. This one is called China, and it's a sort of collection of the achievements of the first decade of the Maoist power. But many other publications showing these achievements, such as a book called Beijing, one about the railway station of Beijing, some about women in China. So like all the topics that the Communist Party wanted to cover and promote were the subject of such photography books. These are some examples of the content of the book. And this one, for example, the editorial committee was the Ministry of Culture and the Communist Party. And they created ex nihilo an editorial committee with individuals from these two structures to edit this book. This tendency was enhanced during the Cultural Revolution, and photo books were a way to consolidate the cult of personality around Mao. This is maybe one of the most distributed books of the time. That can be called that is called Chairman Mao is the Red Sun in our hearts, which was also a song and which was also a slogan that you could see in factories, on the streets, etc. It was published in 1967 and republished many times. And as you can see here, the republished or the remaining copies of this book have been hand-edited, either by cutting out some political figures such as Lin Biao, who were no longer accepted or no longer part of the official history, or inking them out. And this provided the basis for a project by Chinese contemporary artist Zhang Dali, who published in 2012 a book called A Second History, where he's not an author neither, but he collected the mini versions of one photograph and how the Communist Party can be considered a sort of author in showing how images are reframed, are edited, colors are changed, etc. Right after the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, the first collective of Chinese independent photographers was born out of a movement that is called the Tiananmen Incident in 1976. Just following the death of Zhou Enlai, some artists, poets gathered on Tiananmen Square on the Day of the Dead to mourn his death, and they were arrested. The poems that they created back then were considered counter-revolutionary, and the year after, the situation totally changed. As Mao died, the Band of Four was arrested, and this event of 1976 was reconsidered and considered revolutionary. So this group of photographers was allowed to publish a book that was called Morning of the People, and you can see some photos on the left side, which are still quite look as propaganda photos, but it's the first time that they are authored and that it doesn't come from the state. This collective born in 1976 was called April Photography Society, and they organized the first independent exhibition in 1979, after which they published the first catalogs of independent photography exhibitions. So you can see some images here. Right here you can see an image of Wang Keping, who's an artist of the Stars movement, with his famous sculpture Silence. So this shows some of the artistic practices that were born around the movement of the democracy wall, and yeah, maybe can be considered in the modern time the first type of independent publications of photography. In 94, I think, Zhongzhong, Liu Zhang, and some other artists created the first photography magazine. It was 4 issues, and it was reprinted 10 years later, so in 2003. And it sort of paved the way for self-published type of magazines, journals, or photo books. And this one from 1990 is the first publication of an artist, a photographer, by an official publishing house. So this is just to provide some background to the contemporary books that Simon and Zhen Shi are going to introduce.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Simon Baker. I'm director of the MEP in Paris. I'm very happy to be here with Jen. I was remembering before when I first met Jen, she was in Arles and she had this like pop-up book place, and I was like, "What are you doing here?" And she was like, "Someone has to show like Chinese books in Arles. They're not doing it properly." And she was very like kind of strong advocate for Chinese contemporary independent publishing. Now, of course, Arles is very much in China, so it's a different context. What I thought I would do today, Jen and I made a plan together to talk about independent and self-published books, and in Asia generally. I thought I would start by talking a little bit about Japan, although now I'm very nervous because I see much more expert people than me sitting in front of me. really to talk about the idea of what is avant-garde publishing, when publishing becomes, leaves the kind of, let's say, like propaganda or institutional world and becomes something that artists engage in very directly. And I think, I know Jen is going to talk about this later. I thought I would start with a few examples, historical examples. The first I put here is by Kikuji Kawada. It's called The Map. It's from 1965, and it's a book about Hiroshima and the photographs that he made of the hypercenter in Hiroshima, but they're done in a really, really beautiful and very abstract way. And the thing I wanted to show you really was how the book is double folded, so that your experience of reading the book is very intimate. You have to turn the page, and then you have to open it, and then you have to close the pages, and then you turn to the next page. So each the experience of looking through this book is slow, and I think it's intended to make us think about the events of the Second World War. It's also very important that it was published exactly 20 years to the day after the events themselves, and so it's a kind of looking backwards from the 1960s, from an avant-garde moment back to a moment 20 years beforehand. It's a very, very strong book. The design is very strong. I'm pretty sure it's Sugiura, the designer, Kohei Sugiura, who designed many of the really great Japanese books of the 1960s. So we can think of it also as a collaboration between a really great photographer and a really incredible designer. The second example I picked, sort of historical example, is Barakai, Ordeal by Roses. I actually picked the second edition because the second edition of Ordeal by Roses was made with Tadanori Yoko. So it's, again, a collaboration between a really important graphic artist and a photographer. And of course, Barakai by Hosoe is already a collaboration because it's a series of kind of performative photographs of Yukio Mishima. So it's photographs by Hosoe of Mishima, and then the design by Tadanori Yoko. And it's a really special object. It's a very luxury object. It's really an artwork in its own right, and it's mixing really beautiful photographs, beautiful drawings, very luxury packaging and presentation. And it's really way beyond what you need to do to make a book. It's an object. It's a thing. It's an artwork. And when we think about the sort of really important photo books of the avant-garde times in Japan, they were the things. It's not as if they were books of a show like a catalogue, but they were the thing themselves. And then, in many cases, the images were exhibited after the books were made, rather than the books being made afterwards. They weren't always very luxury, and I picked another a sort of more down-to-earth one. Iraqis' Sentimental Journey. It's a very, very sweet book. It's a story of his honeymoon with his wife Yoko. It remains one of the most romantic, most beautiful, most sensitive books in the history of art, in my opinion. It's incredibly intimate, very personal, and very, very basic. It's a small format, black and white pictures, very simply on the page, no kind of design tricks, no kind of games with the material. It's a very, very simple thing. It's now a very, very expensive thing. If you want to buy one, you're going to need $7,000 or so, I would say. But it's a very simple proposition, and it helps us to understand a little bit. I hope the choices that I've made are things that show you the range of kind of levels of investment, levels of printing, levels of binding, and so on. The probably most important, however, person to talk about in this regard is Dido Moriyama, because we're going to talk a little bit about self-publish. Moriyama was the person who really pioneered self-publish in a kind of quite radical and quite homemade way. So this is, for example, Record Number 1. It's a very, very small magazine. I think it's like 6 pages or 8 pages, maximum 8. It's just one tiny album, as if he made sort of 5 or 6 pictures and then decided to publish them as that was his week's work. He's still doing it now. There's record number 40 something now, 42. So he still makes these kind of albums, and I think that the nice thing with Moriyama is that they're extremely limited in their presentation. There's very little kind of graphic intervention. It's just the images, one after the other, very simply printed. and very direct. I mean, his idea was, as it still is now, get my pictures out to my audience as quickly as possible in this sort of simple and direct way. A lovely example of that is his project, Another Country in New York. I carefully made photographs of my facsimile copy, because the original one is thousands and thousands. I've seen a copy of this for $65,000. And that might sound like, oh wow, that's not expensive for an artwork. This is a photocopy book. It's made on a photocopier. It's not high end. So what he did is he silk screened the cover with a proper silk screen machine, and then he literally photocopied all the pages over and over and over again and kind of stapled them in. And when you see them, they're totally homemade. And whenever I see younger artists, when I talk to younger photographers and artists, I always tell them about Moriyama's photocopy books. It's like, you don't need a contract with a publisher, you don't need any money. You go to the photocopy machine, you stick your pictures together, and you start to sell them. That's totally enough to get yourself going, right? Or you could find a really great publisher. So Moriyama is interesting for this kind of can-do, homemade kind of process. And I kind of could mention Provoke, which is a magazine that he did, but I prefer to skip forward to this book that I bought at Le Bal in Paris about 6 years ago, maybe. They had a little book fair in Le Bal. And I don't think they have book fairs anymore at Le Bal, but no, I think they do. I'm joking. So they still have book fairs there. I bought this little book by Daisuke Yokota, who's a younger, at that point maybe in his late 20s, I think, young Japanese artist. And again, he'd made a very, very simple black and white kind of Riso or digitally printed book. I think I paid €5 for it, or something like this, 5 or 10 euros. And that idea I really liked. It was very direct. I loved the pictures. I loved the image. I loved the fact that it was very cheap and I could buy it. And I think there's something really important. If you think about self-publishing, that one of the things about it which is great is the democratic fact that you can, without being a very wealthy collector, you can engage in supporting young artists in their practice. This is another book by Daisuke Yokota which is handmade. And he came to London once and he had no money and he was selling the handmade books to pay his trip. He had a kind of backpack full of these beautiful he printed all the pages himself and sewn them together. And it's a really beautiful object, but totally homemade and totally outside of the sort of normal publishing process. And this kind of thing, to me, reminds me why it's exciting to go to book fairs, why it's exciting whenever you go to an art fair to go to the place where the publishers are. They might have something like this. They might have something which is handmade, homemade, if not unique, then in a very small edition. And this really, and you can see actually, I just then put a couple of his later books that are in a slightly larger edition. It's very similar. The aesthetic is always quite similar. It's always using quite soft printing on quite simple paper and quite simple bindings. There's nothing that needs. There's no way that this would be better if Gerhard Steidl made it. It's totally perfect the way that Daisuke made it himself. And there are versions of his books where he's actually, like Moriyama, worked with silkscreen to make kind of colored versions of the images. These become essentially more expensive, but they have all the little mistakes and differences that you get when you silkscreen. So when you buy these kinds of books, when you see them, and they're not tremendously expensive, they're sort of a few €100 rather than tens of euros, you're getting something which has got the real feeling of an artwork in book form. So it's a very nice one. I put a couple more things. I don't want to talk too much because I want to hear what Jen has to say. But I put a couple more of the younger contemporary Japanese artists. This is one that I love because of the cover. It's kind of sewn together by hand. It's by a guy called Yusuke Yamatani, and it's called On to the Next Night. And again, it's quite a simple book. It has a little bit of poem in it, text, a series of his. Yamatani is definitely a night owl, and this is very much his life and his friends, his circle. But again, it's a very, very simple thing, and then the cover is very handmade and kind of very tactile. And I quite like this, that he made essentially quite a simple book, but then he made it very special by the binding. Then some of the other younger artists, I wanted to make sure we have some women working in Japan as well. This is an early book by Tokyo Raimondo. Again, it's very simple, has a very photocopied blurry, kind of washed out look, the printing, which reminds us a little bit of the early books by people like Moriyama. It's a very nice one. This is her pretending to be Yuki Mishima, so I can connect that with Josue. This is a book which actually Clément, raise your hand, Clément, has downstairs. This is a total discovery that he made and presented to everybody. I saw it in Arles a few years ago at the book fair by a guy called, I'm probably going to get his name wrong, Toshitsugu Yamawaki, is that right? And he's made this incredible, it's probably like 2,000 pages or something, I don't know. It's huge, huge, hand-bound, hand-printed and hand-bound, absolutely beautiful series of his photographs printed by him, paired together in these chapters which look as if he's trying to tell us that they mean something, but it's almost impossible to tell what he means. It's a really incredible thing. As soon as I saw them, even though they were the biggest things I'd ever seen at a book fair, I was like, okay, Clément, so I have to buy this, don't I? And he's like, yeah, you do, like this like really incredible handmade object. And that's something of the enthusiasm that I get, that I think probably Clément's customers get, is seeing things, and Jen also makes the totally unique handmade objects where you really feel that you've just stumbled across something that's very, very meaningful and very, very, very special. So just show you a bit of that. Then another example, Hideko Tonomura is a fairly young Japanese artist also, and again there's a handmade, kind of printed, very simply printed, hand-bound, and then the painting she's painted herself on top of the on the pages. So you have her reproductions of her little Polaroid pictures that she made with painting. And this is very nice. It has really the feeling of a tiny little album, like something she may have made by hand at home. And it's quite a small edition. I think it's maybe 200 copies or something like that. And it's her and her friends messing around at night in Tokyo. Ill-advised, I would say, but... And then this book I saw recently in Tokyo, I don't know anything about it at all, Hiroshi Yuki Taniguchi, but it's really beautiful, beautifully printed. Again, very, very simple, beautiful use of the color tone, all two-tone, with kind of simple images, but beautifully produced with these blank pages interspersing the images. I think it's a very, very nice book. And then my segue to the very imperialist Chinese people on my left is some of the earlier Chinese self-published artists. One of my favorite is 223, Lin Jipeng, who's making these fantastic kind of albums of his kind of daily life. Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? I couldn't... these are Jen's fingers as well. She was very keen to get near to the cock there. His books are fairly anecdotal, but then mixing these very anecdotal photographs with very beautiful pictures that then become the basis of his exhibitions. And even better known, I guess, for other reasons, Ren Hang, who he published for 1 year a magazine every month. So this is obviously November. So he would make these self-published series of small, inexpensive things, very much like Moriyama, to get his work out there. They're now fabulously expensive. And then another Li Jinpeng book, which just to show like the difference between his original self-published and a more heavily designed, more kind of carefully produced book. This is one done by Pierre Bessard with a very special kind of attitude to censorship, where you have the images censored and then uncensored afterwards. And then one of my personal favorites, Pixie Lao, who's in the fair here at Chambers Gallery, I think. This is a fantastic book which Jen put me onto. Get a lot of information from her. This is Pixie Lao horribly abusing her much younger Japanese boyfriend in a whole number of, now husband, in a whole series of humiliating games that she made him play around their house. Turning him into a giant sushi is our favorite. We decided. And the last one I put, because I'm rushing, an artist I just discovered very recently. I was in Bordeaux. I went to a fabulous photo book store called L'Ascenseur Végétal or something like this. And they had a whole group of books by an artist called, is it Mate? Mate. Young Chinese woman photographer. And they had from very, very handmade kind of zine type books like this up to a really huge, beautiful book about concrete with a kind of amazing hardcover, but all in very small editions and all made in a very showing her work in a very immediate and very direct way. And I think this is something for me, this is the last thing I'm going to say, I promise. What's really important about self-publishing and small publishing editions is the ability that it gives people like myself who are working in a museum to research deeply very quickly. So we go to, like Jen's table at a fair, we see maybe 5 Chinese artists that we haven't seen. You see their work in depth, you see that they have an interesting attitude to design, to sequencing, and you really get an understanding of the artist's work rather than just seeing 1 or 2 pictures. You really get a good sense of what they're doing, and I find that it's very, very compelling, and it's probably the most research that I do. I'm not saying that art fairs are bad, but the book parts of art fairs, especially photo fairs, so in Paris Photo you have the book part, you have polycopies, and you have off-print. These are the places where I do all of my research, and but I count on people like Jen to tell me, as she definitely would, when I've forgotten something or missed something or ignored a really tiny country like China from my knowledge. Anyway, I'm going to pass over to you because I want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Simon, for the presentation of Japanese part, and thank you, Victoria, to complete the background of all the historical part about Chinese publishing. And welcome to the contemporary section. Okay, so here is my part from 2004 to this year, that art book in China from Photo Yard to Douban. That actually Photo Yard and Douban, they are 2 websites, exist from 2000 something around that, which influenced a whole generation of young photographers in China. It's here. So as Victoria said before, we have a long history about publishing in China, but the Avant-Garde publishing is very recent, and it's just came after the year of 2000 because of the publishing law and because of the censorship control and because of a lot of things. So all the the most part of the publications before year 2000, they are, here I'm showing my personal favorite book from I call that the catalog book, photo book era, it's a trilogy made by a super photographer in Magnam called Lu Nan. It's the Forgotten People. He's using 3 books to talk about all the forgotten, the phantom people in China, in the orphanage and in the psychological hospital, etc., etc. So in this epoch, most of the Chinese photo book are like serve as a catalog, or it's in a very classical way, that is the simple layout in left side and the right side. And then until in 2004, there is a online platform called Photo Yard came into our eyes. Personally, it's my youth nostalgia, because there's a lot of kind of famous photographer from China in our days. They are originally born in Photo Yard. So here I'm going to show you a few cases, the generation about Photo Yard here. This work is from Zhang Xiao. The first one on the left is the coastline, which has won the Bourse du Talent here in 2010, and later won the Prix HCBC. And the one in the right side is the work in a little bit earlier before that called Day. It was made in 2012. And then here is the famous Feng Li. His work called White Night. He is one of the best street photographer in China, and he kept to make the snapshots every day in the street in Chengdu where he lives and works. And here is a photographer called Luo Dan that is not that known here in the Western world, but a landmark photographer for us in China. That he was firstly very famous in photo yard because he is really the contemporary photographer who still employ collodion, like an very old technique of photography process using to shoot in the contemporary way. Here is his most famous project called 318, Road 318. Comparing this road is a road starting from Chengdu, where he lives and works, and until Tibet. It's kind of a road trip like Robert Frank made in the Road 66, but the Chinese version. And here is sorry, this is my paper. Here is from a woman photographer called Liu Yiqing, aka Qingtou Yi. She was a kind of first generation of a woman photographer, came out and showing on the stage in contemporary photography world. And later when the photo yard turns over, over this website, she is now becoming a Buddhist. And here is a work of our 223. And here is a work from another great woman photographer called Luo Yang. She works over 12 years already on one single project called Girls, which is to show how nowadays the Chinese women we are. Actually, for most part of Western people in early 2000, they have a kind of images for Asian women that we are something like cutie, sweetie, and we can't really afford for the heavy things, and we're not that good for gymnasts or something. So here is a very kind of low-fi resolution for a photo yard. This is my last archive in 2009. That's the last time I can log into my photo yard account. So this magic platform, they have a very basic design, even we can say very low-fi. Firstly, all the photographers that I talked about, they get proposed by the 4 little square like a promotion, and then when you had more likes, we are going to the biggest images, and then under the zone you have all the names listed, depends on the likes. So this could be the very origin Chinese-born version about before many years before before Facebook and Instagram. Then later, Photo Yard was closed from 2009, 2010, around that. And then most of these artists moved to another platform called Douban. And also in this time, from 2008, there is the first, and I always kidding, they are the publisher of China in photo books as well as in art books, called Jiazazhi, that their books just downstairs with us in the book corner. And they are kind of very important places to build what is the Chinese art book and Chinese photo book in our days. So this is the first book Jiazazhi made in 2011 with the artist called Sun Yanchu, his very first photographic work called Obsessed. And this book is also included in the Chinese photo book written by Martin Parr. It's a very simple book, simple zine with a couple of pages and all the images selected by Sun Yanchu in his early work from Photo Yard era. And there was a very interesting story behind that about Jiazazhi as the first publishing house opened in China. Originally, the publisher Yan You, he worked in a super media company in China called the New Media. And then in around 2008, he decided to come out from the company and to do something and to make the real publishing instead of the catalog photo books. And then he met Sun Yanchu. They decided to do something together, but none of them know how to really printing a photo book. And so they made a selection of pictures, and they build the editing line by purely gut feeling, and then they throw the pack to a printing house, and then the boss of printing house said, okay, I think it's a black and white photo that you can only print with one single black color, that will cost less. And then both of them said, okay, it costs less, that's a good sign, let's go for that. And this is later, 1 year later, that the publisher finally learned a little bit more experience and make a real book. And it's, it's the coastline of Zhangxiao when he won the Prix HCBC. And this is a kind of experience of Jiazhazhi publishing, that they are always trying to still keep the photo book in a way, in a manner to present photo, but add something very interesting and to complete the story. Because in the body of work of Zhang Xiao, he was originally a journalist for a newspaper in China, and to do this project, he almost spend his everything. And I still remember that before he packed his work to Prix HCBC and Books du Dalang, he has only the last 200 Chinese yuan left in his bank account. And he said to us that this is my last try. Whether I win the prize and I got money to continue my art career, or whether I just go back to the newspaper. And luckily he won, and here is the book with Jiazhazhi. And this is the famous White Knight made by Feng Li. It's kind of interesting because the work of Feng Li is a kind of a brutal, very outsider artist, a kind of. And the work of Feng Li is absolutely surrealistic. And his real job in the real life, he is an officer in the government of China. So it's a kind of very interesting comparison in between. And I think this is also a very interesting point for my generation in China, that people are making books and people are making art. That one side, we still have the big tradition, and we are very linked to the paper thing, to the old media, to broadcast. And another thing, since from years of 2000, every new information or high technology came from Western world, has made a big shock. So we are like living in between a huge earthquake. So that's maybe how Qingtou Yi can make this kind of a very early artist handmade book called, the translation is kind of weird, Hit the Inducer. So this is the kind of beginning of a handmade artist book by Chinese artists. It's only a book of 27 images in black and white, and it's binding in the way of a notebook. It's only a very limited edition of 10 copies. I hope you can find that somewhere. And this is my personal very, very favorite artist, Sun Yanchu. I met her when I was very, very young. And he is the one that I just talked and have no idea how to print a book, and let's go for the cheapest way. But in another hand, he is a great artist for the handmade artist book. I will even not call that a book, because every book is big like this, and something like 10 or 12 kilograms, and all made by the real metal, real wood, real everything. And then the year 2015-2016 is another new era for Chinese publishing, that we got our first art book fair in China, in Shanghai, with Shanghai Minsheng Art Museum, made by a group artist collective called the Dreamer Factory. And the title of the book fair called Art Book in China. The first edition was taken in 2016, and then 2017 or 17, I think, got another second art book fair called Unfold. And in this era, I bring some very kind of quote landmark publication. First, this cigarette pack. We have already sold 5,000 cigarette pack made by Jia Zhi in the world. The artist is a French artist, but not that Frenchy. He's mostly a Chinese guy, Thomas Sauvin. This is a part of his huge project called Beijing Silver Min that he found by accident. A huge abundant archive films in the rubbish recycle place. And this little cigarette in this original package is a how to say that? The content for this book is talking about a tradition in 80s and 90s in China that during the marriage ceremony, we offer this cigarette to the visitors because this is called double happiness. It's a kind of signification for the lucky and for all the sweet things after the marriage. But when we are looking through all the images inside, sometimes it's really hardcore images, and it's something very funny. And even when we made, I remember when Yan Yu made the first edition of Double Happiness, he sent a post on Douban as well as on the social media to ask people, if you still have the package of this cigarette, please send us the package, and then we will return you the book. So the first edition was really made by the original different kind of version of cover, of the package cover. And the second edition is around already over 1,000 copies, so we can't really recycle everything. So we bought the real cigarette and we put the cigarettes outside. So during 3 months, every friends and colleagues in Jia, we don't really want to see the cigarette anymore. And even some smoker quit smoking because of that. It's a nice thing. And another one is this one made by a woman artist called Chen Zhe. She is showing in Shanghai Express, the special project here. And this is made by a very talented avant-garde designer in China called Guang Yu. I think these 2 books is really something new in the publishing world in China to say that from this day, the photo book, I mean the book itself as what we understand, the paper stuff, has becoming somehow to a kind of object. It's a kind of callback to, I need to pronounce that well, Koiri Sujula. That the great designer after post-war who made the map and killed by roses. And then these 2 books published by myself. It's a little bit awkward to talk about that. And this is the first one, not the very first one, but the one that we published last year, and this is the new one of this year. This is talking about the Chinese marriage market that in a park of, thank you, in a park in Shanghai called Shanghai People's Park, that the parents, they organized the blind date and they organized the marriage for their children, and they gather together every weekend to exchange the information. Thank you. Yeah, in their little tiny notebook. And the project itself was exhibited as well in Jimei Arles in Xiamen some years ago, and then later in the Arles in France, and then this year in MAP with a studio platform. The very original version of this project actually was a performance because the artist decided to, she used to live in London for quite a long while, and she decided to went back to China. And at that moment, she was in a relationship with a Chinese guy, and then the parents didn't agree to that they get married because of she was too old, quote, but only 33 years old. And then she started to put the question on herself by asking, am I too old to the marriage market? And what is this exactly the social problem in nowadays, that the pressure on women, and we need to get married in what time, and we need to have a children on what time? Then she put a A4 paper, exactly like this, putting the single information of herself, that which diploma he got and what kind of guy she's looking for, and with a little horror, with a GoPro hidden afterward. So that's how she presents herself in the park and gets judged by all the parents in the corner. And this project, so the very original version was a video, that which is also some screen print was included in the book, to show how the people think about the society. And I think this is another manner that I want to really bring into the publishing world, is how the book itself can hold the different ways of art. I mean, photo, of course, we have photo book, and like design or risography or caseography, all these different kind of a paper-based art form we can get published by book. But how can we somehow publish a non-existed on paper work in a book? I think that's the kind of a research topic for me during my publishing experience, as well as the second one, Uncharted Place by Wang Juyan, is a very, very young artist living in London, but Chinese in original. In this way, in this book, we're trying to challenge a new way and a new experience about reading a book, because his original work was the super big screen folding, 1.50 m by 2.50 m each, and there's 4 or 3 or etc. different panels. And all the work are made by the digital collage, which was taken, originally the image was taken in the monumental landscape, like Summer Palace in Beijing, like the place of the World War, or the 911 thing. And actually it's a quite political questions posed to the audience, that how they beautiful landscapes that we can look at, but actually behind the scene, there was so many very sharp political things. And also my dear colleagues in China, in the different world of publishing, they are trying to bring something new and fresh ideas in this world. This is the super famous kind of banana fish mini zine boxes. Banana Fish is another publishing house, as well as an independent bookshop in China based in Shanghai. This is their 11th year. They started more or less the same time as Jiazhi Press. They are more focused on the design or Rizo or zine thing. And this is I think it's a brilliant idea to introduce this is a new thing to Chinese people, and the mini zine box is a kind of interesting thing to do, that they gave the carte blanche to the artists, to the designers, to writers, and even to children. To everybody, we have a full size of sheet of paper, and with 12 pages, and you are free to do everything with it. But the single rule is you need to complete these 12 pages with one single color. And every box contains 12 different booklets. And before you open it, you don't know what is it inside exactly. So every time I buy a mini zine box for myself, it's like a kind of chocolate box. Then I need to discover, and I can learn more about the different people in the art world. And this is by a kind of, since like crossover is becoming more and more popular in a lot of different places. This is a first try this year by Dream Factory, which is the organizer of art book in China, with a super nice emerging, no, not emerging, avant-garde, yeah, emerging musician, which is making abstract music. So this is a kind of nice answering for my previous question that how a book can contain things of different way. This book called Dom, which is a kind of visual, and also by listening, a paper research and book research about the Dom music. And I think I'm finishing my blah, blah, blah.
I think we got to the end.
Yes.
Are there any questions?
Explained it very well.
I have one. What is it like publishing in China nowadays? Because right now we are discussing some photo books and artists here in Paris in an Asian dedicated art fair. And like you said, in China, in the past 3 years, there's been two fairs for photo books created. I know as a fact that some of the artists that you introduced today, for us, it's very difficult to show their works in China, in a public space. We have to go through censorship, so I would like to know how it's done for a young publishing house like yours.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a very interesting point because self-publishing and independent publishing in China, actually, it's legally illegal due to the publishing law. Because there is one thing, the number stuff called ISBN, that as I live in France for quite a long time, so I don't really understand why it's so difficult to get an ISBN number. But in China, yeah, sorry, I have to say that it does. Very difficult to get us. So even in the book fairs, like I think was last year in Lianzhou Photo Festival, they have a small book market. And we were censored, and we were, so for the first day of the vernissage of the book market, we have to excuse ourselves because most 50% of the books, we don't have the ISBN number, so we are not allowed to show that and not to sell them. And 30% we are using Hong Kong ISBN number, so we don't have the import certification, so basta. And then another 20%, yes, they paid for the ISBN number, but somewhere they always can find something to censor. It's a kind of difficult for Chinese artists or Chinese publisher to live on that, really, if they live only in China. And but there's always a way. There's an old saying in China that the government, they always want to control something or check something, but the people, we can always find a way to work out. So there is a lot of nice photo books, the independent one, secretly one, like Banana Fish in Shanghai, or like Jiazazhi in Ningbo, which is in another province, and some more and more spaces and libraries and museum. They are getting involved to the publishing world, and I think it's not that difficult to reach out. Or if not, there is a thing called Google. And another thing, some can find by plagiat photo that Clément is going downstairs. Or l'Ascenseur Végétal here in Bordeaux, or the map has a new nice library. I think thanks to all these opportunities that it's becoming more and more accessible.
And we'll say thank you very much for listening. Thank you.